Today, we hear a lot about socialism. Rather than going straight to the historical record, I find it easier to explain using popular media that touches on the subject and putting it into a more clear context for viewers. This time around, I'll be using HBO's wonderful 2019 miniseries, Chernobyl, as well as the 2019 film, Mr. Jones. Both feature socialism prominently and can be used to shed a little light on why so many people are talking about socialism these days. The Chernobyl miniseries' first episode has a great example that we can break down and discuss. Keep in mind that if you haven't seen it or Mr. Jones, there will be spoilers ahead. The first scene we want to take a look at is the meeting of the Pripyat Communist Party Executive Committee. HBO was kind enough to publicly post the scripts for the entire miniseries, so we get a little more insight to what was intended to be displayed on screen as well. To set the stage for this meeting, what we need to know is that Chernobyl, only hours ago, has had an accident, the severity of which had not yet been ascertained, and we'll see how the meeting plays out.
Gentlemen, welcome. Please find a seat, plenty of room. I apologise for the lateness of the hour. Rest assured, we are all very safe down here. We built this shelter to withstand the nuclear attack by the Americans, so I think we'll be fine. As you can see, we have experienced an accident, a large control tank malfunction damaging reactor building 4 and starting a fire. Now, I have spoken directly to Deputy Secretary Marian. Marian spoke to Deputy Chief Frolishev to Central Committee member Dolgeek, and Dolgeek to General Secretary Gorbachev. Now, because the Central Committee has the greatest respect for the work of the Pripyat Executive Committee, they've asked me to brief you on matters as they stand.
We can see that the committee members have been woken up in the middle of the night to deal with the accident. Brukhanov welcomes them with a friendly demeanor and a smile on his face. He doesn't want concern or fear, and so he smiles and advises them of their safety. The friendly demeanor fades into the well-oiled language of a politician. He's acknowledged there is a serious problem and has followed a rational course of actions in contacting other politicians and governmental bureaucrats, all the way up to the General Secretary of the Communist Party, Gorbachev himself. Brukhanov states, because the Central Committee has the greatest respect for the work of the Pripyat Executive Committee, they have asked me to brief you on the matters as they stand. To put this in context, in February of 2021, imagine there was a nuclear accident in the United States. I don't find it difficult to believe the federal government would issue a similar statement when dealing with the local government. That being said, I think it's hard to believe that the federal government would have the greatest respect for the local and state government where such an accident occurred. Accident and nuclear are words no one wants to hear in the same sentence for good reason, and accountability is crucial in this area.
First, the accident is well under control. Second, because the efforts of the Soviet nuclear industry are considered key state secrets, it is important that we ensure that this incident has no adverse consequences. Now, to prevent a panic, the Central Committee have ordered a detachment of military police to Pripyat.
How large of a detachment?
Between 2,000 and 4,000 men.
Brukhanov states that the accident is well under control. As we know, the accident clearly was not under control. This is a flat-out lie on his part, but given that he's already established that the mechanisms of the government are already aware, involved, and acting, it lends credence to his lie. He then pivots to national security, which is determined from above the local Pripyat Executive Committee, that military intervention of 2,000 to 4,000 soldiers will be required to ensure that there are no adverse consequences. Not entirely irrational logic given that this took place during the Cold War years, but its primary purpose was to give over complete and total control of the area to the governmental apparatus. National security is important, but given the situation, shouldn't the primary concern be the safety of the people whose lives are in danger? Since we have the script, I'd like to highlight the following line. The members glance at each other. Here it comes. What does that mean? In this case, it's to convey the sense that the citizenry, even those who make up the local executive committee, are used to this kind of language and what usually follows it. Their trust in the government is overall not very high, even though these are all members of the political party that controls the government. We can see many are not overly enthused, to say the least.
What's really going on here? How dangerous is this?
There's mild radiation, but it's limited to the plant itself.
No, it isn't.
Excuse me?
You saw men outside vomiting. You saw men with burns. There's more radiation than they're saying. We have wives here. We have children. I say we evacuate the town.
As we can see, one man, Petrov, is quite concerned with this. We can look at his language. What's really going on here? How dangerous is this? After he's told how many military police will be arriving in the area he's at least partially responsible for. Fomin, one of the bureaucrats in charge of Chernobyl, responds to Petrov's concern by stating there's just mild radiation and only in the plant itself. Except, as we just saw, Petrov isn't buying what he's being sold. He's clear and strong in his disagreement with Fomin. Petrov addresses the others, stating clearly that he's not a country idiot, he's university educated, and he knows what he and others have seen. Men vomiting, men with burns, men who were not in the area Fomin just described as limited to the plant itself. They lied to his face and he was expecting it and spoke up. Having the script helps us here as well. More whispers, evacuate, to where? Depending on what people on the executive committee believe, he's either correct and they should evacuate, or he's paranoid and delusional, trying to make everyone afraid for no reason.
Please, my wife is here. Do you think I would keep her in Pripyat if it wasn't safe?
Brukhanov, the air is glowing.
The Cherenkov effect. Completely normal phenomenon, can happen with minimal radiation.
The scene has gone from a friendly start to mildly chaotic. People are murmuring under their breath. Brukhanov is trying to convince them that they have it under control. Petrov makes the clearest point that the air itself is glowing. One of the nuclear operators, Dyatlov, attempts to provide cover with another lie, using a different scientific phenomenon to explain away the glowing air. A panic is starting in the room, let alone in the city, making Brukhanov's point about avoiding a panic more urgent.
I wonder how many of you know the name of this place. We all call it Chernobyl, of course. What is its real name?
The Vladimir I. Lenin Nuclear Power Station.
Exactly. Vladimir I. Lenin. Yes. And how proud he would be of you all tonight. Especially you, young man. And the passion you have for the people.
Here, Zarkov speaks up. He's much older, he lived in Russia when Stalin was in charge, and the name of Lenin holds great sway for him. What did he add to the conversation? He added political propaganda to the situation. He begins by tying himself to authority, and is why he brings up Lenin, who has a sort of mythological status in Russia. He invokes Lenin the same way an American might bring up Lincoln, with the same appreciation and reverence, though for a quite different reason. He takes control of the situation by diffusing Petrov's concerns. Rather than argue with Petrov, or mocking or belittling him, he plays on his good nature. He tells him how proud Lenin would be of him, his passion for the people whose lives he hopes to potentially save by an evacuation, even if it meant speaking his mind and bucking authority and the potential consequences that might have. We should examine Zarkov's words with a little more scrutiny than the others.
For is that not the sole purpose of the apparatus of the state?
For is that not the sole purpose of the apparatus of the state, he asks. In America, in the broadest sense, the sole purpose of the apparatus of the state is not about protecting the people from harm. Its purpose is more along the lines of making sure the citizens are undisturbed in pursuing life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It's a different ideological perspective. The United States government apparatus is designed with the intent to make sure your right to pursue those things is not being infringed at an individual level. Before we go back to the scene, I'd like to focus on a line that's provided in the official script that is not in the show. It would have fit in just fine, but for one reason or another seems to have been left out. It does, however, shed more light on what we're talking about, so we should take a look at it as well, especially as it comes from Zarkov. From the Central Committee all the way down to each of us in this room, we represent the perfect expression of the collective will of the Soviet proletariat. What he's describing here is that the Soviet system is much less concerned with life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Not that they are unimportant things, but rather they are achieved through expression of the people. Meaning, even on the executive committee they are all part of, the power is in their hands to make the correct decision that's best for all of the people. Petrov certainly doesn't agree with Brukhanov, yet only one decision is going to come out of that meeting of diametrically opposed views and will be enforced on the people. How often is a good decision or a bad decision that comes out of such a system we can decide on for ourselves?
Sometimes we forget. Sometimes we fall prey to fear. But our faith in Soviet socialism will always be rewarded. No, the state tells us the situation here is not dangerous. Have faith, comrades. The state tells us it wants to prevent a panic. Listen well.
Zarkov is appealing to them through patriotism when he says their faith in Soviet socialism will be rewarded. Instead of addressing Petrov's point about the air glowing after a nuclear accident, men vomiting or with burns, he instead appeals to their character. The state is the authority, and it has their best interests in mind, and he implores them clearly to listen well, while he hasn't listened to any of their concerns. In essence, he is stating, you don't know what you saw, you don't know better even if you've been to university, even if you saw things with your own eyes that the state says is not possible.
It's true. When the people see the police, they will be afraid. But it is my experience that when the people ask questions that are not in their own best interest, they should simply be told to keep their minds on their labor and leave matters of the state to the state.
Here, he does at least acknowledge Petrov's concerns about the fear that the people will have when seeing the military police. Russia has its own history, and Petrov has reasons that are entirely reasonable for concern on the topic. Zarkov himself is no nuclear expert or scientist or knowledgeable on the subject at all. He's knowledgeable in politics. He has no problem telling the proletariat what's in their best interest, even if he has absolutely no idea in any way, shape, or form what he's talking about. Instead, he falls back on the Soviet governmental apparatus, which can be boiled down to the proletariat have no idea what they're dealing with, they can't do anything about it, but the state knows, and the state can do something about it, so leave this to the state. It's ironic. Zarkov is trying to enforce his will on the committee, and by extension the people of Pripyat, despite his complete and total lack of knowledge on the subject. The people, as well, likely have little knowledge on the subject, but Zarkov is directly harming them by keeping what little knowledge they do have out of the hands of the people. They can't make good decisions on their own if information is withheld from them.
We seal off the city. No one leaves. And cut the phone lines. Contain the spread of misinformation. That is how we keep the people from undermining the fruits of their own labor. Yes, comrades. We will all be rewarded for what we do here tonight. This is our moment to shine.
Here, we can see the authoritarian side come out. Zarkov can tell he has the room in the palm of his hand. It's time to enforce his belief and faith in the state, and we can see that by the actions he suggests with absolute certainty. His concern for the citizens can be summed up as, the state knows what's best for the people, so the state can do what it wants to the people. It's in their own best interest, and they don't require consultation about it. Can you imagine what they might think, say, or do if they were allowed to? This is a rather chilling thought given the climate we find ourselves in today. Worse, Zarkov promises them rewards for their obedience in doing a thing many of them disagree with. Their names inscribed into the Kremlin, rewards for everyone in the room, recognition, promotion, financial reward, political reward, all of it is yours for the taking. Why ignore such riches? The script explains the following reactions. Many of the executive committee members decide to buy what Zarkov is selling. They see his faith and want to take part in it, stars in their eyes accompanied by loud clapping. Except Petrov and another young member. Their concerns have gone unheard. They've been dealt with and dismissed and seen their fellow members ignore their own eyes, their own history, in favor of the rewards for falling into line. As the script points out, applause for delusion, applause for death. We'll skip ahead to the third episode of the miniseries for a moment as well. A joke told by the leader of the miners that will be needed to help at Chernobyl tells us more about the apparatus of the Soviet system. Explaining jokes usually isn't the funniest thing, but in this case it adds a little more context to the situation.
Here's one. What's as big as a house? Burns 20 litres of fuel every hour, puts out a shitload of smoke and noise, and cuts an apple into 3 pieces. A Soviet machine made to cut apples into 4 pieces!
This joke didn't seem all that funny to me on first viewing, despite the way the punchline was delivered and the laughter that followed. But understanding it adds another layer of depth. So why is it so funny? The miners, from all depiction, are definitely part of the proletariat. When Zarkov was talking about not wanting the people to undermine the fruits of their labor, he was at least in part referencing people like the miners or those similar to them. He didn't want them to be warned. They might flee and someone needs to do the mining, and if they flee they might not have the means of surviving without their income. He thought it better they be unwarned, unaware. The state would deal with it for them, no reason for them to know anything at all. So what does the proletariat think of the state? The joke is coming from a place of dark humor, the sort of it's better to laugh than to cry type of humor. Does anyone need a machine that burns 20 liters of fuel an hour? A machine that puts out a huge amount of smoke and noise to cut an apple into 3 pieces? Of course not. It's utterly ridiculous, insanely expensive, utterly wasteful. The punchline is that the machine wasn't even doing what it was built to do, cut an apple into 4 pieces. The joke is not about an apple cutting machine. The joke is about the Soviet government in the 1980s. Glukov sees the system as one that takes up a huge amount of authority over the people, wastes its human resources, causes huge problems for everyone, and the damn thing doesn't even do what it's supposed to do in the first place. This is not an uncommon sentiment among the proletariat. It's also not a sentiment you'll often hear in the halls of the Kremlin or from anyone looking for any kind of advancement in Russian society at the time. Where Zarkov has absolute faith in the state, Glukov sees it as a broken machine that just keeps producing the same problems over and over. Again, we get to go back to the script and we can focus on what a writer and executive producer of the miniseries was trying to show. Glukov's laughter and smile fades as he sees the black sedan with the small Soviet flag on the hood. Another miner spits in disgust at the sight of it. They are not fans of the Soviet system, to put it mildly. Now, in Chernobyl, Zarkov is the oldest character. He was certainly alive when Stalin was in control of Russia, a true believer in the system. Of course, we're talking about an HBO miniseries, dramatized further for a TV audience, and the character of Zarkov does not even exist in real life, though the writers did an excellent job creating the character to make a point, one that is totally and fully in line with what happened historically. If you didn't see any of that in Zarkov's character when you first watched it, I wouldn't blame you. Instead, I think to understand what the writers had in mind when creating his character, we need to go back a little further. Here's where we switch over to the film Mr. Jones, which depicts a Welsh reporter's attempt to get an interview with Joseph Stalin. A reminder, if you haven't seen the film, which is recent, there will be spoilers. I highly recommend watching the whole thing, though. The titular Mr. Jones does manage to gain entry to Russia, and his various attempts to get an interview with Stalin run into roadblocks that were unexpected. His contact in Russia, who's promised him a story of tremendous magnitude, ends up dead before Jones can speak to him. His only other option is to seek out the head of the New York Times Moscow bureau, a Mr. Walter Duranty, who had held the position for some 10 or 11 years at the time. Let's examine a bit of their meeting for the first time. There's a lot of information the viewer likely doesn't have at this point, especially if they're not familiar with the relevant history, so we're going to try and unpack this almost line by line.
I read your article. Do you think Hitler really believes the things he says?
Lots of people say that he's deranged.
Mm-hmm. What is deranged? In a deranged world.
Duranty has read Jones's article on Hitler, which you can find easily enough online, and wonders if Hitler really believes the things he has been saying. He's quite aware of how crazy Hitler sounds, and this is in the period right before Hitler took over and before Germany began attempting aggression outside of its own borders. He's rightfully concerned over what happens when someone so clearly mad has control of a country such as Germany. Even then, Duranty's response, "What is deranged in a deranged world?" is his way of saying, who am I to judge in this crazy world? Why on earth would anyone say that about Hitler of all people? In what horrible manner must they view the world as so deranged as to admit that it's so bad that even Hitler's genocidal rhetoric could be shrugged off? A question to keep in mind.
There's talk in London we're headed for war.
Britain cannot afford another war.
Can the Soviets? British engineers, new factories. How is Stalin paying for it all?
Money, I suppose.
This exchange also offers up a morsel of information. Jones is more curious about Russia's finances. He's well educated, has some of the best qualifications that could be asked for at the time, and his conclusion was that Russia couldn't afford what it was doing in the same manner we understand that a credit card has a limit. It was obvious not just to him, but to many around the world, and he wanted to know how they were doing it. Thus his naivete in thinking he was going to get an interview with Stalin. Equally, Duranty's response is telling as well. He evades the question with a glib answer. It's a deflection of sorts, and once again, a polite and politically correct one. A skill that Duranty puts to good use on a regular basis.
Then he's not paying for it in rubles.
You know how rich this country is, how vast. South is nothing but wheat fields. Grain is Stalin's gold.
That's a lot of grain.
This little segment contains a lot of condensed information that is best understood in historical context. After all, that's what the film is trying to represent accurately, even if it's dramatized for entertainment purposes. Jones isn't satisfied with the politically correct but evasive and witty type of response he received, and points out that if Stalin were paying with money, he certainly wasn't doing it in rubles. It's his equally glib way of poking a stick at Duranty, America's premier newsman in Soviet Russia. He should know the facts as well as Jones does. Jones has done his work well. Duranty's response points to the wealth in general of the country, not just its economics, but its resources. This is why he points to the bountiful wheat fields and how grain is Stalin's gold. Jones is quick to point out that would be quite an impressive amount of grain. Jones's implication here is that the value of wheat is relatively so low that for it to make up the difference between what Russia can actually afford to spend and what it is spending would be unimaginable, a ludicrous proposition. He wants to know what Duranty knows.
The 5-year plan is more than double in your output.
With this information handy, Duranty's character starts to take on a subserviently sinister attribute. He is a New York Times Moscow bureau chief, well educated and fully capable of doing journalism. And he's aware of the famines, the plans, the starvation, and above all of those, he is keenly aware of the propaganda. Despite his awareness of the propaganda and its absurdity, he repeats it to Jones as if it's fact. It's part of why he made the earlier comment about the deranged world. For Duranty, Hitler is just another power-hungry madman. By that point, Stalin was busily in the progress of murdering millions of Soviet citizens through starvation. With this tidbit of historical knowledge, we can also hop back to Duranty's comment that wheat is Stalin's gold. It's significantly more valuable to Stalin than gold. Controlling who has bread or not is a much more powerful tool to eliminate those deemed undesirable and ensure compliance. Durante is constantly being sly and sarcastic with his responses, the conscience of a monumentally guilty man. As the film continues, Jones is further curtailed as he finds he is not legally allowed to leave Moscow, which only further piques his curiosity, as well as the odd behavior shared by most of the people he meets with. Without meeting Stalin, he decides to ignore the law and sneak out of Moscow to find out what is going on, as there's nothing for him to learn in Moscow. What he discovers is the Holodomor, starvation everywhere, people dead of hunger in their own homes, and his own food supply disappearing nearly instantly. He travels for some time before coming to a small town where he finds a huddled mass of people in the snowstorm waiting in line. You can see that bread is being distributed, and one man is quickly attacked by another the moment he receives a portion. Disturbed, hungry, and freezing, Jones manages to ask a woman in the line what is going on. He hasn't encountered many living people on his journey outside of some young children.
Как долго это продолжается? Как долго это продолжается?
Кто вы?
Я журналист. Чернозем. Так его назвала моя мама. Черноземный край. Мой путь прокормить мир. Пожалуйста, скажи мне, что случилось.
Как вы думаете, что случилось? Они убивают нас. Миллионы погибли.
Миллионы? Почему?
Приехали люди и решили, что они могут изменить естественный порядок вещей.
This part needs less breaking down. It's entirely plain spoken except one part. Men came and thought they could replace the natural laws. What exactly did she mean? In short, natural law is what human rights are based on, also referred to as negative rights. Those rights which you have before any government of any kind exists. This is opposed to positive rights, rights granted to you by law or society. Stalin used a positive right to make laws that resulted in mass starvation in the population he ruled, the 5-year plan being part of that. And the woman is pointing out that he came along and he thought he knew better, that he could ignore natural law in favor of his own ideas, which could only be enforced by creating positive laws that violated natural law. Keep this in mind whenever you hear a politician state things are a human right. They're usually talking about a positive right versus a negative right. So, getting back to Zarkov, his character would have been alive during that time, however young he might have been. It's very likely where Petrov's distrust of the Soviet state comes from, not to mention the miner's much more frank dislike of the Soviet system. As the saying goes, history doesn't repeat, but it does rhyme. Chernobyl ends with a somber message.
The truth doesn't care about our needs or wants. It doesn't care about our governments, our ideologies, our religions. It will lie in wait for all time. And this, at last, is the gift of Chernobyl. Where I once would fear the cost of truth, now I only ask, what is the cost of lies?
You know, Chinese leaders, if you know anything about Chinese history, it has always been the time when China has been victimized by the outer world is when they haven't been unified at home. So the central, vastly overstated, the central principle of Xi Jinping is that there must be a united, tightly controlled China. And he uses his rationale for the things he does based on that. I point out to him, no American president can be sustained as a president if he doesn't reflect the values of the United States. And so the idea, I'm not going to speak out against what he's doing in Hong Kong, what he's doing with the Uyghurs in western mountains of China, and Taiwan trying to end the one China policy by making it forceful. I said, and by the way, he said he gets it. Culturally, there are different norms at each country, and their leaders are expected to follow.
The level of mediocrity in a big establishment like New York Times, Los Angeles Times, major television network, you don't have to be excellent journalist. You have to be exactly a mediocre journalist. That's easier to survive. There's no competition anymore. You have your good, nice income, $100,000 a year. That's it. Whether you're better or worse doesn't really matter anymore. As soon as you're smiling to the camera and do your job. That's it. No more competition.